I'd like to review the idea of feedback inhibition or feedback systems. This is one of the ways that our body maintains homeostasis. And there's two types of feedback you may be familiar with. There's positive feedback and negative feedback. Positive feedback and negative feedback. And to better understand these, negative feedback. To better understand these, we can look at a homeostasis system, or a system that provides feedback to an integration center. We've seen this with reflexes already and other examples in the course. So let's look at a feedback loop. And there's some essential components to a feedback loop. Usually there's some kind of receptor that receives the signal, some kind of input. In this case, it would be an afferent pathway from a sensory neuron, but for now I'll just call it the input, into an integration center. This would be the central nervous system. If we were talking the CNS, or the nervous system, or the body, this is going to be an integration center that can make sense of that input. And then there's going to be some kind of output. If this was, let me use a different color. If this was the nervous system, I'd do it in green to represent a neuron. If it was the endocrine system, I would do it in red to represent the bloodstream. But the integration center is going to send out some sort of output. Now this would be an efferent pathway for the nervous system or motor. For the endocrine system, this is going to be the bloodstream carrying some kind of signal out to an effector. An effector. So I don't want to use red or green because I don't want to confuse it with the positive and negative feedback, but we'll do an effector out here of some sort. Let me darken up that purple. See if I can't do it a bit darker. And this effector is going to affect the original stimulus. So here's my stimulus coming in. Okay, this could be a reflex arc. This could be the nervous system working. It could be the endocrine system working. It involves a feedback loop. And this is the 5 components of our feedback loop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, in positive feedback, the final effect on the stimulus is going to increase that original stimulus. In a negative feedback, it's going to decrease the original stimulus. Decreases that original stimulus. So I'll just use the most basic example that most instructors use, and that's the thermostat in your house. If you have sunshine, or let's do heat hitting your house, there's receptors or sensors inside the house that sense that heat. Heat is the stimulus. The first part of our feedback loop is going to receive that heat. It's going to send a signal to the thermostat, and the thermostat makes sense of that heat and says, oh, it's too hot in here. I'm going to activate the air conditioning unit. So it sends out through a wire a message to the effector, the air conditioning unit, to turn on and cool the air inside the house, which decreases the original stimulus of heat. Okay, this is a negative feedback loop. Now it's become too cold, and the new stimulus is cold. The sensor senses that, it sends it to the integration center. The thermostat says, oh, it's too cold. I'm going to send out a signal, an output that turns off the air conditioning unit. And this is going to decrease the amount of cold or the stimulus. That would be a negative feedback. Now, we've already seen positive feedback loops. For example, the effect of oxytocin on uterine tissue during parturition or delivery. Oxytocin is received. Actually, what stimulates the oxytocin is stretch of the uterine tissue. Okay, that's an oversimplification, but let's call it stretch as our stimulus. These sensory receptors feel that stretch, and they send a signal to the brain, to the hypothalamus actually, to the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, and it excites that neuron, causing that neuron in that integration center to release oxytocin into the blood. And that oxytocin reaches the smooth muscle of the uterus and causes that smooth muscle to contract. And actually, when it contracts, it excites those stretch receptors even further, so we've increased the stimulus, the amount of stretch that those receptors are feeling. So they send more signal to the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, which causes it to release more oxytocin. More oxytocin, more contraction of the uterine tissue, which pulls on those receptors more stretch, more stretch, more signal, more oxytocin, more contraction, and it goes harder and harder. We have a positive feedback loop until the baby's born. And then all of a sudden, there's no more stretch on that uterine tissue. And the positive feedback loop ends abruptly. Now, these are much more common in the body, negative feedback loops. These are rare. These tend to bring us back to homeostasis. These tend to take us further away from an equilibrium point. These turn off and on as we try to hover around a central balance point. These feedback systems go and go and go, and then they end abruptly. That's the tendency. Not the tried and true way to figure out a positive versus negative feedback loop. The official definition of either increasing or decreasing the stimulus is the way to determine them.